Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with random book reviews from the Overflow Room Annex. And the heat's probably going to go on in a minute, so I apologize for the whirring and buzzing down here in the basement, but it's either that or freeze my ass off, so we're going to have heat. Oh, there it goes. We're going to have heat. I'm sorry. But here we have a collection of 4 or 5 books that are really, well, for me, they were fascinating. They really were. Now, will they be fascinating for you? Probably not. But I want to share a few excerpts with you just to sort of tell you where I was at when I was reading them, because it's awfully nifty, I think. But first, Joseph Szigeti on the violin. Oh, what a wonderful violinist he was, and a real intellectual. I mean, a brilliant guy. This is a Dover reprint of his original book. I wonder when it was originally printed. Unabridged republication of the original 1969 edition. It is a wonderful historical survey of the history of the violin and its performance history, particularly when Szigeti was just starting out at the beginning of the 20th century, how concert programs have changed, and then performance tips with scads of musical examples. I mean, I only played the viola for like 10 minutes before I decided that it was like not for me, but I know enough about it to know just how interesting and useful this book would be, and I think it's absolutely great. So I dip into it periodically. It's interesting just to read for itself. It really is, because he was such a wonderful musician. Then I have 4 books on the incredibly obscure topic of organ registration. Now, you might think that is beyond esoteric, but it really isn't. It's actually a fascinating topic, first of all, because organs are amazing instruments. I mean, they're just dazzlingly complex, and each stop has its own history. And I'm a historian. I like that kind of thing. Your eyes may glaze over, and I don't blame you. But really, it's very nifty. But the reason I was looking into this is because I wrote a paper as part of my research into historical performance practice, and particularly the use of vibrato in orchestral music, which I've talked about endlessly, and I know, and you're going, oh God, here he goes again. But now we get to talk about some of the source material. In most of my talks, I just make, sort of categorical statements like period instrument people are stupid and they don't know what they're talking about. Well, that's often true, and it's particularly true when it comes to this topic. But if you want to know what some of the interest is behind it, this is the way to do it, because I wrote a paper on orchestral vibrato in the 19th century, which was published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, and it's all and I researched this thing like crazy. How do you determine that there is a performance technique used that we can't hear because there was no recordings? There are no, surviving exemplars of that particular style of performance. I maintained that orchestral vibrato was normal and constant. And in order to do that, I had to go back and look at people talking about what orchestras were doing. And where they were talking about what orchestras were doing was in the organ literature, because concert hall organs, which evolved starting around the 1830s and 40s in France with Cavaillé-Coll, the great French organ builder, they tried to imitate orchestral timbres. And in order to do that, they had to describe what orchestras were doing. And they talk about vibrato extensively, the different kinds of vibrato that you hear in the orchestra. And I have a bunch of these books date mostly from about the 19 teens to about 1920, 1921, precisely when experts like Roger Norrington and other fraudsters were telling us that orchestras didn't play with vibrato, and never sounded like they played with vibrato, and they don't hear vibrato. It's all nonsense. And we know it's nonsense. We know it's nonsense because these guys tell us. Here we have a primer of organ registration by Gordon Balch-Nevin, published in 1920. Let me give you a little excerpt of Mr. Balch-Nevin. He talks about, practical suggestions. Learn when and when not to use tremolos and stops of the celeste, that is vibrato type, because organs have two types of vibrato, the tremolo and the celeste stop, which make vibrato in different ways. For many years, it has been the fad of purists to practically insist that these stops were the desolation of all that was abominable. It's a great phrase, the desolation of all that was abominable. A viewpoint not without some foundation when based on early specimens of the stops in question. So people were using them like crazy, but they sounded horrible, according to some. However, with the present perfection of the tremolo and the various beautiful string and flute celeste stops, these mandates can well be relegated to the forgotten past. So then he goes and talks about how these things are used. And he says, the celeste stops infuse an orchestral warmth. Get it? Orchestra. In the same way as the duplication of string instruments in the orchestra produces a liveness of tone attainable in no other way. Yes, that's the point. And in fact, another one of these organ books, let's see which ones we have here. This one is Everett Ellsworth Truitt, Organ Registration, a comprehensive treatise on the distinctive quality of and tone of organ stops. And it says more or less the same thing the other one does. I mean, they're very consistent, these things. And then we have, George Ashdown Audsley. He was like a major guy in the United States. He was the guy who designed the enormous World's Fair organ that became the basis for the giant Wanamaker organ in Philadelphia, which is now Macy's. The world's largest, well, not the largest, but second largest, I think, concert hall organ. The largest is in Atlantic City, in the convention center, and it's still not fully up to working potential yet. It has like 30 billion stops. It's just crazy. Anyway, he's an interesting guy. I have a bunch of his books. We may talk about some other things he says anon, because he's a character. All these organ people, they were like nuts, and they're really fun to read. But this is the really good one. L'Orgue Moderne by Alexandre Cellier, with a preface by Louis Vierne, who says that this is his technique, etc., etc. It's les jeux d'orgue, les mécanismes et les combinaisons, exemple de registration ancienne, l'orgue et l'orchestre. There we go. The organ and the orchestra. So let's just see what he has to say here in my fabulous French. Voix céleste. Here we go. La voix céleste n'est autre qu'une gambe accordée un peu plus haut que la gamme au diapason des autres jeux. Right. So it's the voix céleste is nothing but a scale tuned a little higher than the normal pitch of the other stops. All right. And by adding it, he says, there is a light dissonance created between the two ranks of pipes, which produce des battements, ou sorte de vibrato, analogue, a sort of vibrato, analogous à celui que produit sur une corde de violon, le mouvement du doigt, déplaçant le son, faisant osciller en quelque sorte dans la limite d'une comma environ. So yes, it's just like when a violin wiggles their finger and does vibrato. Similar to that, actually. Not quite. Ces battements donnent un timbre délicieux. These vibrations, these beats, give a delicious timbre. Même dans l'aigu où la gamme seule est un peu maigre, especially in the higher register where the scale is a little bit weak. That's what he's saying. However, there is a footnote, and this footnote is fabulously indicative of the point I was trying to make in this paper about how stupid the period instrument people are. He writes, On observe plus exactement ce phénomène à l'orchestre dans un ensemble de violons jouant à l'unisson sans vibrato. Les légères différences d'accords inévitables produisent l'effet de la voix céleste. Okay, what he says here, en anglais here, pardon my grotesque French, One observes more exactly this phenomenon in an orchestra in which the violin ensemble plays in unison without vibrato. The light differences in intonation inevitably produce the same effect as the voix celeste. In other words, it does not matter whether a violin section uses vibrato intentionally or not. The fact is, in terms of violin technique, is that in order to do something without vibrato, they have to be told, because every player does it however every player wants to do it, and you wind up with an amalgam of what all the players are doing. But if you were to tell them not to use any vibrato, to try and make an absolutely dead tone, then what you would get would be similar, still you would get a vibrato, because they're all tuned slightly differently. And these micro differences in intonation produce an effect similar to the voix celeste on the organ. So playing in unison with no vibrato is the special effect. Playing without vibrato, even without intentional finger vibrato, even though no one ever does it that way, unless the composer says so, will still produce vibrato, because of the natural difference in intonation between all the violin instruments. So orchestral string tone has a warmth and a corporate sonority, which is at least partially the result of constant, continual vibrato tone. And there's no question about it. So there you have it, my friends. A little bit of backstory to some of my studies and some of the books that I managed to get my paws on along the way. And remember, this is all from the teens in 1920, I think is the latest, 21, in the 19 teens. So early 20th century. And we can find the same comments, the same remarks. In fact, we will at some point in here, going back into the 19th century. Pretty far back in the 19th century. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.